friends, Dave Paulides, Canam Missing Project, copyrighted edition for our YouTube channel. And this is Huck TV. Huck is the boss. Huck is the executive producer. Huck makes the calls. She is the boss. And she's giving us a side eye right now, if you notice. Oh, that dog is too smart. I can't even get over it. But we'll get on with it because we got a lengthy episode for you that is going to be a little stunning, I think. Because these aren't your normal disappearances that we're going to talk about. A couple of things. First of all, thanks for being here. Make sure you're subscribed, right? Want to make sure you're subscribed. And I know many of you aren't getting notifications. I'm sorry. And many of you have commented that you can't give me a thumbs up because there's no thumbs up on your screen. What can I say? It's a strange, strange world. But we're not going to waste any time. We're going to get right into this. First case involves a man named David Howton, 64 years old, missing November 2nd, 1956. In my books, I talk about missing sheepherders. A lonely job out in the middle of nowhere, just you and the livestock. A lot of times these have been happening in Wyoming, Idaho, Washington, Montana. Well, this case, Mr. Howerton, he was raised in Newport, Arkansas, lived with his wife. He worked for what's called Basket Ranch. And he worked for him during the lambing season. And there were always a couple of Australian sheepdogs in the area whenever he was out. Again, this was in Wyoming. Well, on November 1st, the ranch hands had dinner at the Basket Ranch. And it was a rare occasion because most of the time all the ranch hands never got together. But the sheep were in close, and so Mr. Basket wanted everyone to come in and have dinner, which they did. And he was at dinner with all of his hands. And he and David were close because David didn't work for him all the time. It was only during lambing season. Well, he came over to him and he asked David how he was feeling, and David said he had a really bad headache. And he says it was just kind of a passing comment. He says, I'm not sick, but I got a pretty bad headache. Well, after dinner, David left to go mind the herd. And the next day, ranch hands went out to check on David, and he wasn't there. He had left a note stating that he was out looking for some missing sheep. So stop there for a second. The number of times that I've written about people that have disappeared going to check on animals is phenomenal. Most of the time, somebody goes out looking for missing cows, steers. This time it was sheep. Well, that was on November 2nd. November 3rd through the 6th, everybody on the ranch was looking for him. And they kept moving the perimeter out further and further. And then they started to cover ground that had already been covered twice before. Well, at 1 p.m. on November 9th, this went on for 6 days, covering areas that it had already covered before. David's body is located in a small gully 45 miles north of a place called Powder River, Wyoming, in Indian Creek. They stated that it appeared that David might have fallen 25 feet, landed, and stayed unconscious and had not moved. Now, I've never seen this in any report ever. Searchers stated in an unusual note that the ground under the body, where the body had landed, the ground had been indented 1 to 2 inches from the body blow. Article stated it was a terrific impact. That's a little odd. In fact, I'll say that's ultra odd. No dogs were with him. One of the dogs was never found. The livestock was never found, the sheep. And he was that subgroup of missing, he was a sheepherder. When I think of a 25-foot drop, first of all, I doubt it. I doubt it because this man had worked in the area for many years, but only in 30-day cycles. And a 25-foot drop, they made a note that it was highly unusual and very deep. I tend to think maybe he was dropped a little higher than that. Just my feeling. Next case happened out of Washington. Also a sheepherder. Man's name was John Davis. Went missing August 26, 1956, 8 miles east of Burbank, Washington. So this is Burbank. This is the Columbia River. This is the Oregon border. 8 miles east, he was out in this area named Rouleau, Thiel, Sudbury. This is a lonely area out here, folks. But you can kind of see. Well, being a sheepherder, he worked for the R.J. Hooper Ranch. And he had been staying alone at the ranch, minding the livestock. The owner was out of town. The other people were given leave, so he's alone there. So supplies were coming in on August 26th. And they drove in with the supplies, and they couldn't find John, which was super unusual. They searched the area, found a majority of the sheep, couldn't find him. The person called for local ranchers. They all responded, and they came in on horseback, on foot. They weren't finding anything. Search went on for 5 days. They didn't find anything. They found it highly unusual. In fact, there was talk that maybe he just abandoned the stock, but nobody believed it because he was such a reliable and known sheepherder to this part of Washington. Nobody believed it. And they thought over the next couple of months, if he had walked away, they were going to find him. But they hadn't. 6 months later, February 18th, 1957, a fellow sheepherder named Pat McDermott was with his stock about 1.5 miles from the ranch house where John was staying. And he finds John's body within that primary search zone in a field. Originally, it was believed that he died of natural causes. But the article stated, but circumstances piqued the interest of investigators. Pat McDermott found John naked laying in a field with his clothes neatly piled next to the body. That's what it said. What? Now, next to his clothes were his watch and his billfold, and in the wallet, the billfold, was a significant amount of cash. Investigators said because there was cash in the wallet, there was no foul play. But they were baffled by the scenario. The fact that he was extremely trusted, reliable, and diligent in his sheep herding, all of this made no sense whatsoever, It also made no sense that he wasn't found during that initial search. Remember, this is in Washington. Washington, Idaho, Wyoming, Montana have some of the weirdest disappearances of all time. Now, I'm going to ask you to spend significant time paying attention to this story, because this is going to lead into something that I've never talked about before. So, I was looking into the disappearance of a young man named Dillon McKinnon, 17 years old. He went missing October 17th, 1932. He was a student at Billings High School in Montana, and he came down to Wyoming with family and friends to hunt. Montana border up here. Trapper Creek Wilderness, this is the area they was hunting. This is Graybull, Montana. This is Highway 25, which comes up from Colorado, goes all the way through the middle of Wyoming. He's hunting in this range right here, the Bighorns. I've had several cases where I've written about disappearances in those mountains. So Dillon was described as extremely strong, super smart, had hunted since he was 13 years old, every year, was an excellent horseman. Everything about him exuded his experience in the outdoors. Nobody worried about him. Well, on October 17th, Dillon was with his friends and he went out and he shot an elk. He came back to get his horse because he was going to go back out, get the elk, clean it, and haul it back in. And he told his companions that he was going to go out and get it and be back before dark. That was on October 17th. As this was happening, an unexpected, serious storm was coming in. And Dillon didn't come back that night. The next day, his friends, family got other hunters from Graybull to help them go out and search for their son. But they returned because of extremely cold temperatures and dense fog. Remember that, dense fog. And the Bighorns were the center of the search. His friends said that Dillon rode out on his horse and he had matches, so they knew he could stay warm if he wanted. But this was a serious storm. And it was unexpected, that's what they said. From October 19th to October 24th, 1932, searchers from Montana and Wyoming converged on the area with the assistance of the local sheriff, and they were looking for Dillon. They had some of the most experienced hunters and ranchers in the area that knew that country upside down and backwards. Well, as they're searching, it kept snowing, getting colder, weather was miserable, it was bad. Finally, on October 25th, everyone, including the parents, agreed to give up the search because they didn't know where else to search. And the weather was horrific. They knew their son couldn't live through it. Now, unrelated to the search, on October 28th, there was another hunting party that was near Timberline at the upper reaches of Timber Creek. And they're walking along and they come to a big pine tree. And under the pine tree, they see what's essentially a big bed of pine needles. They started looking around and they found Dillon laying on the bed of needles, frozen, stiff, with his boots and his socks off. His horse was never found. The sheriff came in. Well, first of all, the hunters left. Yeah, they all heard you. Sheriff came in, removed the body. He commented that Dillon was higher in the range and near timberline in an extremely remote area. Dillon was the only young person to ever disappear in this area, and I did an extensive search. Other people in the other Bighorn range, yes, but not anywhere close to this. Now, why do I say this? Because during my research on this, I was blown away. I was blown away. There's a story in the Cowboy State Daily, October 19th, 2024. And it says, Haunted Wyoming. First of all, the Cowboy State Daily, big newspaper, great articles, said lost hunter saved by ghost boy in the Bighorn Mountains. A 17-year-old hunter lost on Trapper Creek in Wyoming in the Bighorns in 1951 found his way thanks to a boy in a red flannel shirt. Locals say he was saved by the ghost of another 17-year-old boy who died on his own hunting 19 years earlier. In 1951, a hunting trip in Wyoming's backcountry took dire turn for a teenage hunter when he became lost in a thick fog. He believes that he would have come to a tragic end except for a supernatural intervention that to this day cannot be explained. The hunter told the story to Deborah Munn, author of a book called Wyoming Ghost Stories, but asked to remain anonymous. He had kept his story secret for more than 35 years and still had no answer for what had happened to him at all those years ago. He just knows that it is real and not a tall tale despite the naysayers. It was fall 73 years ago and the 17-year-old was hunting elk with his father and a small group of men. They have left their camp on a cold, cloudy dawn to hunt in the timber of North Trapper Creek in the Bighorn Mountains. They could see their breath as they plunged deeper into the woods, rifles in hand. The tall pines towered above them as they hiked and crunched in their boots, only the sound in a desolate country. When you are deep in the woods and you don't hear anything, like nothing, it's spooky. And if the only thing you can hear is the crunching of your boots in the snow, it makes me nervous. The rugged cliffs, spires, and massive rock outcrops emphasize the rugged isolation. The clear, cascading Timber Creek ran through the canyon, its waters glimmering. By mid-morning, the hunters ran into a herd of elk, and each one was successful in bringing down one. For the rest of the morning and into the early afternoon, the men cleaned their game. Afterwards, they rested, talked amongst themselves, and enjoyed the solitude of the Bighorns. According to Munn, as they chatted, the weather turned colder and heavy fog began to settle in. Familiar, right? It was mid-afternoon when the youngest in the party, a 17-year-old, was chosen to walk back to their camp to bring back the pickup truck. He knew the area like the back of his hand, and his father was confident in his abilities. It was about 2 to 3 miles across 2 canyons in North Trapper Creek. However, the teenager hadn't gotten far when the fog got even thicker. I knew right away that things weren't right. That was the quote. The white mist rolled in all around him, nearly obscuring his view. He lost his bearings. Rather than head back, he forged ahead. His path became steeper and thicker. Quote, I knew that things weren't right, the hunter told Munn. The fog at that time was so thick that I couldn't make out any familiar landmarks. I considered staying put, building a large fire, and waiting it out. I kept going. I was getting tired and a little panicky when I suddenly looked up in a clearing. There was a faint image of a young man standing there. He was wearing a red flannel shirt and pointing in the opposite direction where I was headed. I hollered at him, But before I could say or do anything, the fog moved into the clearing and he disappeared. Still, not knowing where I was, I began walking in the direction he had pointed, and soon I came to a road, followed it, and walked right into our camp. That is pretty weird. Stunned, but relieved, the young hunter waited in camp until the fog lifted, then drove the pickup truck to where his dad and the others were waiting. I asked if anyone had seen the young kid in the flannel shirt, but everyone said no. They loaded up the game, drove back to camp, but then it was dark, and they hung their elk in the trees. He lost his bearings and didn't know if he had crossed one or two of those small canyons, but rather than head back, he forged ahead. The teenager did not stop to think about what he had seen or what had convinced him if that was a real person or not. The next day, still bothered by what he had seen, he left his group, drove over to a nearby hunting camp to ask if any one of them had seen or gotten lost. One of the men had. He said he had begun to lose his sense of direction when suddenly he saw a boy in a red flannel shirt. The boy mentioned urgently to the hunter to stay where he was. Taking heed, the man built a fire on a ridge, stayed there all night. When he started back to camp the next morning, he discovered that if he kept moving in that thick fog, he would have walked right over a very steep ledge. He told me that there had been something strange about that boy, and as tired as he was from the day's ordeal, he hadn't been able to sleep. The hunter said, I didn't tell him that I'd stayed awake the night before for the same reason. And a sheepherder. That wasn't the end of the story. Later, an old Basque sheepherder in Grable told a strange tale to the astonished teenager. He said that only the year before he had encountered an apparition of a boy who had gotten lost and died on Trapper Creek. The 17-year-old did not tell the sheepherder his own story, but believed the sheepherder had seen the same apparition. In the past, he would have regarded it as a tall tale, but now he said he knew better. The boy in the red flannel shirt had been real, and it saved his life. He told Munn, being as young and scared as I was, however, I kept this story bottled up inside me for 35 years, until now. I've been hunting and fishing in the Trapper Creek area many times since '51, but I've never seen any more apparitions, and I don't know if anyone besides the elk hunter or the sheepherder has either. To add to the mystery of the tale, the Basque sheepherder had told the young hunter a true story. A boy had indeed become lost and died on Trapper Creek. It happened 19 years before. On Sunday, October 17th, 1932, in the Casper Tribune wrote about the tragedy. Dillon McKinnon was a 17-year-old Grable youth who was one of the big game hunters lost in the Bighorns in late October. A severe snowstorm had swept the district, and afterwards searchers scoured the area for the young man, risking their own lives in a storm. McKinnon had last been seen on a Monday at noon not far from the Shell Ranger Station between Grable and Sheridan. He'd shot an elk and was en route to bring it in. A party of 14 men from Grable took up the search but returned when the dense fog descended on the mountains, accompanied by severe cold. The teen's parents were hanging desperately to hope that their son had found refuge in an out-of-the-way cabin. Weeks later, the searchers from Casper had success. They waded through 3 feet deep snow in the bleak crust of the big game country. They had given up hope of finding McKinnon when they found his body buried under a half-foot of snow. The editors of the Jackson Hole Courier wrote, resourceful and true son of the mountains, McKinnon had tramped more than 15 miles from his camp in search of shelter in sub-zero weather and swirling snows, only to fall into an exhausted sleep from which he never awakened. When found at the head of Trapper Creek at an elevation of 8,000 feet, McKinnon was resting on a bed of pine boughs. Beside him was his rifle, his boots, and his stockings. Seemingly, they said the youth in utter exhaustion yielded to the necessity of rest. A few facts about the story that were different than what I found in my research on other stories, but that's okay. was the apparition in the red flannel shirt that saved the 151 Dillon McKinnon. I cannot find another young hunter that disappeared in that region. If so, 17-year-old McKinnon had saved his fellow hunters from suffering his own fate at Trapper Creek 20 years after his own death. The mystery may never be solved, but for the 3 men who saw the boy in the red flannel shirt, they know that he was very real and saved their lives more than 70 years ago. Now I'm always thinking how you could make that story better. Well, I know the best forensic artist in the world is Harvey Pratt, and he and I have written 2 books before where I used Harvey to draw what people saw. It'd be fascinating to get a hold of the man, or the 2 or 3 men that saw this young boy in the woods, and sit down and sketch the face of that apparition that they saw. And then go back. Hopefully the McKinnon family would still be in Idaho and see what Dillon looked like. Be fascinating. But the reality of it is something highly, highly unusual happened to these hunters in Wyoming. What I find fascinating is that people report seeing ghosts or apparitions predominantly at night or in compromised weather conditions, fog, rain, snow. And why not in the middle of the day in the middle of Manhattan? A lot of people have died on the sidewalks in Manhattan, on the streets, run over. Why not there? And trust me, I am not questioning what these people saw, 1%. I believe it, 100%. I'm just questioning why this only happens in those locations. And it's not unknown, but it's very rare that multiple people see the same apparition. If you watch, I don't like watching these ghost shows, it freaks me out. It's one thing that just, Dave's not meant to do that. But every once in a while, I'll stumble onto one and watch it. I mean, some people even report getting scratches on their back, and injuries from these ghosts that maybe aren't too friendly. But in this instance, these hunters were saved. There's no doubt about what really happened. So, now Dave would go back to Trapper Creek, go into that area. I'd like to. Yeah, I'd like to know if anybody else has ever been into that Trapper Creek area and had a strange occurrence happen. I know that there's a lot of people that watch this show from Wyoming. I know there's a lot. And I'd love to hear from you if you've ever been there and had something unusual happen. But as I've always said, folks, our world is much more complicated than what many believe. And that complication ensues so many different things. Obviously here we have an entity that's trying to do good and did good, save people's lives. But then my question comes back is, why is that apparition still here on Earth? If you believe people have a soul, then why hasn't that soul moved on? And that's kind of sad to think about. Is that soul trapped here somehow? Food for thought. I appreciate you being here. Huck appreciates you being here. In the meantime, be safe, be kind. Smiles are free. I hope in 2025 it's a better year for all of us. In the meantime, be safe. Make sure you're subscribed. Paulides out.